Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Have you ever found yourself, doing something seemingly illogical, like checking your fridge 10 times, even when you know there's nothing new? Or maybe wondered how you picked up that strange habit from an old roommate without even trying? Well, today, we're unlocking the hidden blueprints of your behavior, from your deepest reflexes to your most complex social interactions. And our mission is basically to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge for you.
It's a rich set of sources, truly. We'll explore how we acquire behaviors, why some stick, and how others fade away. We'll look through the lenses of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. Get ready for some, well, maybe surprising insights into why you do what you do.
So if you've ever wanted to truly understand how our actions are shaped, or maybe how to encourage or discourage certain behaviors in yourself or others, this deep dive is definitely for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with what might be the most fundamental type of learning. When we talk about learning that's automatic, almost like a reflex, what exactly are we getting into? Is that where classical conditioning comes in? And how does it differ from, other kinds of learning?
That's precisely it. Classical conditioning at its core is all about learning based on pairing. It explains those automatic sort of involuntary responses we have. Think of your body just reacting without you consciously choosing to. It really stands in contrast to operant conditioning, which shapes more voluntary behaviors through consequences. And then there's social learning theory, where we learn simply by watching others.
So it's about forming an association almost, like linking things together. And when we think classical conditioning, the name Pavlov usually pops up, right? What are the core elements we need to understand? Like unconditioned stimulus or a neutral stimulus. What are those? Exactly. Ivan Pavlov, with his famous experiments involving dogs, he's a central figure, as is John B. Watson, actually. And yes, understanding the terminology is key. An unconditioned stimulus, or US, is something that naturally, automatically triggers a response. For Pavlov's dogs, that US was the meat powder. It just naturally makes them salivate. That salivation, the automatic response, that's the unconditioned response, or UR. No learning needed. It's built in. A reflex.
Okay, so USUR sequences are universal, almost like hardwired reactions, like blinking if something comes near your eye. But then we introduce something neutral. What happens when a neutral stimulus, or NS, like maybe a bell or a tone, enters the picture?
Well, by itself, that neutral tone, it doesn't really do anything to the dog related to salivation. But here's the fascinating part, the real magic of it. When you repeatedly pair that neutral tone with the meat powder, something transformative happens. The tone, which was originally neutral, eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus, or CS. And then just the tone alone is enough to make the dog salivate. That learned salivation to the tone, that's now the conditioned response, or CR.
And what's interesting is that the UR and CR are actually the same response, salivation in this case. But you mentioned the original unconditioned one is always stronger.
Yeah.
So the conditioned salivation might be a bit less intense. And unlike those universal USUR reflexes, these CSCR sequences are entirely learned.
Yeah.
Right? They can vary wildly from person to person.
Exactly. And a powerful, though, ethically controversial example of this is Watson's little Albert experiment. A loud, sudden noise, US naturally caused fear and startling, UR, in the baby. That's the standard reflex. Watson then paired a neutral white rat, NS, with that loud noise repeatedly. Over time, the white rat itself became the CS, and just seeing the rat would elicit fear and crying, CR, all on its own. The fear of the rat wasn't innate, it was a learned association. Pretty powerful stuff.
That's pretty wild and a bit unsettling. Think about little Albert. So if we know what classical conditioning is, how does it actually happen? Is there a specific ingredient or maybe a sequence that makes it work?
Oh, there absolutely is a crucial sequence. It's quite precise, actually. For classical conditioning to really take hold, the neutral stimulus, the one that's going to become the CS, must reliably come before the unconditioned stimulus. Think of Pavlov again. The tone sounds, then the meat powder arrives. That sequence signals to the dog, hey, the tone means food is coming. It's all about predictability.
Okay, so the NS acts as a kind of predictor, like tone means food is on its way.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if you get that order wrong? Or if they happen at the exact same time, does it still work?
Good question. No, generally it doesn't work nearly as well, if at all. If you do it the other way around, what's called backward conditioning, where the US comes before the CS, like meat powder, then the tone Y,
Right.
or simultaneous conditioning, where they happen at the exact same time, well, you'll find very little, maybe even no, learning occurs. The neutral stimulus really needs to be a signal that the important thing, the US, is about to appear. Our sources also mention a couple of others, like trace conditioning, where the CS stops before the US starts, and temporal conditioning, where time itself acts as the NS.
So like my cats. They know exactly when it's 6 a.m., Time to wait by the food bowl, because that's when they always get fed. The time of day itself has become the signal for food, even without a bell or anything. That's clever.
It is, and it's fascinating how these basic pairings then expand into broader concepts. What really stands out to me is how a learned fear, once conditioned to a specific stimulus, can then kind of spill over. For instance, after little Albert learned to fear the white rat, that fear surprisingly generalized to other similar furry white objects, things like a white rabbit or even a Santa Claus mask. And this happened without any further direct pairing with the loud noise.
Wow. So stimulus generalization. Let me see if I get this. If I had a really, really stressful, panic-inducing licensing exam, that exam situation becomes a CS for anxiety, my CR. Are you saying I might then feel that same anxiety when taking, say, a simple driving test later on? Even though the driving test itself isn't inherently scary, that feeling just carries over to similar situations.
Precisely. Your brain has learned to associate that kind of high-stakes testing environment with anxiety, and that response generalizes it spreads to other similar situations. It's why sometimes seemingly irrational fears can pop up in contexts that aren't directly threatening themselves. Your brain just links them.
That makes perfect sense. Scary sense, but sense nonetheless. Now, that sounds different from what I recall about higher order conditioning. How does that work, and how is it different from generalization?
Right. Higher order conditioning is a bit different. It's a more deliberate process, you could say. It's where you associate a new neutral stimulus with an already conditioned stimulus. So layering the learning. For instance, once Pavlov's dog learned to salivate to the tone, that's CS1, you could then pair a new neutral stimulus, like maybe flashing a light, NS, right before you present that conditioned tone. Eventually, the dog might start salivating just to the light, which becomes CS2, even without ever pairing the light directly with the meat powder. The key difference from generalization is that higher order conditioning involves a new intentional pairing. The new stimulus can be quite different from the first CS. Though it's worth noting, the response strength does tend to get weaker with each successive order or step away from the original US.
Okay, so if these responses are learned, can they be unlearned? If I've somehow accidentally conditioned myself to panic every time I see a certain type of envelope because it reminds me of bills, how do I break that association? Is it stuck forever?
Absolutely not stuck forever. You can unlearn them through a process called classical extinction. To do this, you repeatedly present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus over and over again. So for your envelope example, you'd need to repeatedly expose yourself to that specific type of envelope without it actually containing a stressful bill. For Pavlov's dogs, it meant presenting the tone again and again, but with no meat powder following it. For little Albert, theoretically, it would involve showing him the white rat repeatedly, without the loud, scary noise.
That's fascinating. And this principle, extinction, it's actually the basis for some real-world treatments, right? Like flooding for phobias,
Yeah.
where you expose someone intensely to their feared object, their CS, without the thing that originally caused the fear happening. Eventually, the fear response should decline. But I seem to remember reading there's a catch with extinction, something called spontaneous recovery. What's that about?
You're right to bring that up. There is a bit of a catch. Spontaneous recovery. Even after a response seems to have been fully extinguished, it can sometimes briefly and temporarily reappear after a period of rest, a delay. It's usually weaker than the original condition response, and it typically fades away again pretty quickly with further extinction trials. But it's a good reminder that the original learning isn't necessarily completely erased, just suppressed or inhibited. So just when you think you finally kicked that old association, boom, it might sneak back in for a little cameo. It can be a bit of a rude awakening.
Indeed. Okay, what other important concepts related to classical conditioning should we touch on?
Well, another crucial one is stimulus discrimination. This is basically the flip side of generalization. It's the ability to differentiate between a specific CS that has been paired with the US and other similar stimuli that have not been paired. So Pavlov's dog, for example, could learn to salivate only to a specific 500 hertz tone that was always followed by meat powder, but not to a similar, say, 100 hertz tone that was never followed by meat powder. It's about learning to tell the difference between important signals and unimportant ones.
Right, being specific. And then there's something called habituation. It sounds a bit like just getting used to something.
Exactly right. Habituation is when you get used to an unconditioned stimulus itself, just from repeated exposure. And because you get used to it, your natural unconditioned response decreases or even stops altogether. Think about learning to sleep through that persistent neighborhood traffic noise that maybe used to wake you up every single night when you first moved in. You've likely habituated to the noise, the US, and your startle response, the UR, has faded. It's a really fundamental way our brains filter out stimuli that turn out to be non-essential or non-threatening.
That's a great overview of our automatic responses, the classical stuff. Now, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk operant conditioning. This seems to be more about deliberate actions and the consequences that follow them, right?
Yeah,
How does that work?
exactly. Operant conditioning is all about learning based on reward and punishment, or more accurately, reinforcement and punishment. Unlike classical conditioning's focus on automatic, involuntary responses, operant conditioning explains how we acquire and maintain voluntary, deliberate behaviors. We're talking about actions that require some kind of conscious effort or choice, like actively deciding to study for an exam, or choosing to go to the gym, or even just speaking in class.
So we're talking about behaviors that have an outcome, a consequence. And I know B.F. Skinner is a huge name here. That's why it's often called Skinnerian conditioning. But I've also heard of Edward Thorndike. What was his main contribution?
Thorndike came a bit before Skinner and laid some important groundwork. He developed what he called the law of effect, which
Huh.
basically states that behaviors followed by satisfying consequences are more likely to be repeated, while those followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. He later revised the part about punishment, realizing it wasn't always a simple deterrent, but that core idea consequences shape actions. That's Thorndike. Instrumental conditioning, he called it.
Okay. Law of effect. Makes intuitive sense. Now, for the famous, maybe infamous, four quadrants of operant conditioning: positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment. It sounds a bit like math with the positive plus and negative, but it's not really about good or bad, is it?
Exactly. That's the number one thing to get straight. Think of it purely mathematically. Positive means you add something to the situation, and negative means you remove or subtract something from the situation. And the absolutely fundamental rule is reinforcement always increases or strengthens a behavior, while punishment always decreases or weakens a behavior. That's the goal.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. Let's try an example. Say I'm trying to get myself to take more practice tests for an exam. And after I complete one, someone says, "Great job, that was really good work." That praise is something added, right? And hopefully it makes me more likely to take more tests in the future. So adding something good to increase a behavior, that's positive reinforcement, the reward.
Precisely. You nailed it. That's your reward, making the behavior more likely. Classic positive reinforcement. Now let's flip it slightly. Imagine I kept nagging you day after day about not taking practice tests. Annoying, right? Then you finally sit down and take one, and immediately my nagging stops. Phew! The removal of that annoying nagging is the consequence, and it makes you more likely to take tests in the future to get that relief, to make the nagging stop. Remember, even though something is taken away, the nagging, the behavior of taking tests still increases. That's negative reinforcement. Ah, okay. So negative doesn't mean bad, it just means taken away, and it still leads to more of the behavior. That's definitely a common confusion point. Relief is reinforcing. Okay, what about punishment then? How does that work?
Right. Punishment aims to decrease behavior. First, we have positive punishment. This is when you add something unpleasant or aversive after a behavior to make it less likely to happen again. If a child is jumping on the couch and yelling and a parent yells at them or gives them a stern scolding, they're adding something unpleasant, the yelling scolding, with the aim of stopping the jumping and yelling. Or another example, imagine taking an aspirin and having an intense, unexpected allergic reaction. Something painful is added, and you'll certainly stop taking that particular aspirin in the future.
Okay, adding something bad to decrease behavior. Got it. And finally, negative punishment. This must mean removing something good or desirable after a behavior to decrease it. Exactly. Negative punishment involves removing something of value after a behavior occurs to make that behavior less likely. So if that same child is jumping on the couch, instead of yelling, maybe you take away their TV privileges for the evening. You're removing something valuable, TV time, hoping to decrease the jumping behavior. Taking away allowance is another common example. These can sometimes be tricky to classify in the real world, so let's walk through a quick example from the sources. You have a headache. You take an aspirin. Your headache goes away, you feel much better. What's the contingency controlling your behavior of taking aspirin next time you have a headache? First, what's the target behavior? It's taking the aspirin. Okay, after you take the aspirin, is something added or removed from your experience?
The headache is removed.
Right. Something is removed, so it's negative. Now, does this make you more or less likely to take aspirin again when you have a headache?
Definitely more likely. It worked.
So the behavior increases. Okay, so we have something removed that increases a behavior. What quadrant is that?
Negative.
Hmm.
Increases. Negative reinforcement. It's relief.
Perfect. You got it. It's all about that relief from the headache reinforcing the pill taking.
That makes so much more sense when you break it down step by step.
Mm.
But what about those really counterintuitive scenarios? Like, I think the sources mentioned a kid named Johnny whining. His father slaps him, which sounds like textbook positive punishment, right?
Doesn't.
Adding something painful. But the source said Johnny actually whined more afterwards. How on earth do you classify that?
Ah, that's a brilliant example because it highlights the absolute most critical point. You must look at what actually happens to the behavior, not just the intention behind the consequence or what you think should happen. In that scenario, yes, the slap is something added, so it's positive. But if Johnny whines more as a result, meaning the behavior increases, then for Johnny, in that specific context, that slap functioned as positive reinforcement. Maybe the attention, even negative attention, was reinforcing for him. It sounds bizarre, but the outcome dictates the classification. It underscores why analyzing the effect is crucial.
Wow. That's the real aha moment with operant conditioning, isn't it? It's all about the effect, not the intent. Okay. Now, beyond just whether reinforcement or punishment happens, how often we get those results also profoundly impacts behavior. These are the schedules of reinforcement.
Yeah.
What's the main difference between, say, continuous and intermittent reinforcement?
Right. So continuous reinforcement is pretty straightforward. It's when a behavior is reinforced every single time it occurs. Every single time. This is actually fantastic. The best way for acquiring new behaviors quickly. Like teaching a child to make their bed by giving them a piece of candy every single time they do it. Quick learning. The problem, however, is something called satiation. The reinforcement can quickly lose its value because there's just too much of it. The child might get sick of candy pretty fast, or the praise might start to feel meaningless.
Okay, so it works fast initially, but isn't great for the long haul. So to avoid that satiation and make the behavior stick, you'd switch to intermittent reinforcement, where the behavior isn't reinforced every single time. And this gradual process of switching is called thinning, right? Making the reinforcement less frequent.
Precisely. Intermittent reinforcement is much better for maintaining behaviors over the long term, making them more resistant to extinction. Now, intermittent reinforcement breaks down into four main schedules. These are based on two key criteria. One, is the reinforcement predictable, fixed, or unpredictable, variable? And two, is it based on the number of behaviors performed, ratio, or the passage of time interval?
Okay, four types based on predictability and ratio interval. Let's break those down. First one, variable ratio. VR, variable means unpredictable, ratio means based on action. So unpredictable reinforcement based on the number of times you do something.
Spot on. This is unpredictable reinforcement based on the number of behaviors. The classic example is slot machines in Las Vegas. You never know exactly which pull will win, but the reinforcement, winning, is based on the number of times you play. The more you play, the more chances you eventually have. This schedule produces the highest and most consistent rate of responding, and it's the most resistant to extinction. It's why gambling can be so incredibly addictive.
Ah, so variable ratio is the engine behind slot machine addiction. And I suppose it's also why checking my phone feels so irresistible sometimes. Every notification could be something interesting or important, but it's unpredictable. That unpredictability based on checking just keeps me doing it, even when most checks yield nothing. It's almost unfair how well they've leveraged our basic learning principles, isn't it?
It really is. They understand the psychology very well. Okay, next is fixed ratio, FR. Fixed means predictable, ratio means behavior. So this is predictable reinforcement based on a set number of behaviors. Think of piecemeal work, like stuffing exactly 100 envelopes to get a specific payment. You know exactly what you need to do to get your reward. This leads to a high response rate, but the pattern is often described as scalloped.
Yeah.
You see a distinct pause right after getting the reinforcement, then a burst of activity as the individual works quickly towards the next set number.
Okay, that makes sense. Pause after reward, then work hard. Now moving to the time-based schedules, we have variable interval. Variable means unpredictable, interval means time. So unpredictable reinforcement based on the passage of time, like checking your email or maybe fishing. You don't know when the next email or fish will arrive.
Exactly. You don't know precisely when a new email will land in your inbox or when a fish will bite, so you tend to check or keep your line in the water fairly steadily. This leads to a steady but usually low to moderate response rate. The unpredictability keeps you engaged, but without those frantic bursts you see in ratio schedules.
And finally, fixed interval, FI. Fixed means predictable, interval means time. So predictable reinforcement based purely on a set amount of time passing. I'm guessing this produces the lowest response rate overall, because you know exactly when the reward is coming, so why bother working hard until just before that time?
You've hit on the key dynamic. This schedule typically produces the lowest response rate and the most pronounced scalloped pattern. Think of studying for a final exam. You might do very little work in the weeks leading up to it, then cram frantically in the last few days or week right before the test. Because you know the reinforcement, the test being over, or maybe the grade, is coming at a fixed, known time. Why study hard in week 2 if the test isn't until week 10? Our sources mention pigeons trained on this schedule frantically pecking only as the 30-second mark for food delivery approached, then stopping right after. This schedule is also the easiest to extinguish, precisely because the behavior drops off so sharply when the fixed time for reinforcement isn't approaching.
Okay, so let me try to summarize the takeaway for these schedules. Variable schedules lead to steadier responses because of the unpredictability. Ratio schedules generally lead to higher response rates because reward is tied directly to effort or number of actions. And fixed schedules often have that scalloped pattern, pauses after reinforcement, then births before the next one. Is that about right?
That's a great summary. Captures the essence of it. Now, let's just quickly round out operant conditioning with a few other important concepts that came up in the materials. First, operant extinction. Just like in classical conditioning, this is how you get a learned operant behavior to stop. How do you think it works?
Well, if reinforcement strengthens behavior, then to weaken it, you just stop reinforcing it.
Exactly. You simply stop reinforcing the behavior. If you stop giving a child candy for making their bed, assuming it was on an intermittent schedule perhaps, they'll eventually stop making it. But there's often a common initial reaction when extinction starts. Remember that from classical?
The response burst. An initial, maybe frantic, increase in the behavior before it finally declines, like the kid making their bed even better for a few days, hoping the candy comes back.
Precisely. A last-ditch effort. We also see superstitious behavior develop sometimes in operant conditioning. This happens when a behavior is accidentally or non-contingently reinforced, meaning the behavior didn't actually cause the reinforcement, but it happened close enough in time that the individual forms a connection, like Skinner's famous pigeons bobbing their heads or turning circles because grain happened to be dispensed randomly while they were doing that. They start thinking their action brought the food. Or think of a salesperson who happened to wear a specific brown suit on the day they closed a huge deal, and now they wear that lucky suit to every important meeting, even though the suit had absolutely nothing to do with their success.
Huh. I know people like that. Okay, that makes sense. So discrimination learning and operant conditioning is about learning when to perform a behavior, right? Learning which situations signal that reinforcement is available, like knowing which specific cues signal reinforcement is likely. That's the discriminative stimulus, or SD. And which cues signal no reinforcement, the S delta.
You've got it. For example, you quickly learn which friend you can bake a pie for and get genuine appreciation, SD, versus which friend might offer only criticism, S delta for pie baking reinforcement. You discriminate between the signals your friends give. Stimulus generalization also occurs here, similar to classical conditioning. You perform a reinforced behavior in response to a similar stimulus, expecting the same reinforcement. So, if a pigeon was reinforced for pecking a key under a green light, SD, it might also peck, maybe less frequently, under a slightly different blue light, generalizing its pecking behavior.
Okay, but here's an important distinction I remember. Response generalization. This one is only an operant concept, isn't it? It's not in classical conditioning. This is when you perform a similar but different behavior to one that has already been reinforced, hoping to receive the same reinforcement.
Yes, that's a key differentiator. Excellent point. It's about varying your response, not the stimulus. So, if baking pies for your appreciative friend, the SD, was reinforced with praise, you might try baking cookies or brownies for them next time, hoping for the same positive reaction. It's about having a repertoire of similar behaviors that might lead to the same desired outcome or reinforcement.
Right. Our sources also highlighted things like prompting and fading. That sounds like teaching techniques. Using cues to help someone perform a behavior, then gradually removing those cues as they get better at it.
Exactly, like using hand-over-hand guidance to teach writing, then slowly reducing the physical help. And related to that is shaping by successive approximations. This is huge in behavior modification. It involves reinforcing behaviors that are progressively closer and closer to a desired, often complex end goal, like teaching children with autism to speak by first reinforcing any sound, then only reinforcing word-like sounds, then actual words, then sentences. You build up the complex behavior bit by bit.
Shaping. Got it. And chaining is linking lots of these smaller shaped behaviors together in a sequence.
Precisely. Chaining involves linking individual, already learned, often shaped behaviors into a complex sequence. Each step in the chain acts as both a reinforcer for the previous step and a discriminative stimulus, a cue for the next step. Think of all the many steps required to, say, earn a professional license. Studying, passing exams, getting experience, applying each successfully completed step reinforces you and cues you to move on to the next part of the chain.
That makes sense. Now, I know the Premack principle is often described using a funny phrase, grandma's rule. What does that actually mean for how we can apply reinforcement in real life?
Grandma's rule is a perfect way to remember it. The Premack principle, also known more formally as reinforcer relativity, suggests using a high frequency or highly preferred behavior to reinforce a low frequency or less preferred behavior. The classic example is exactly what Grandma might say. If you eat all your vegetables, low frequency less preferred, then you can go out and play, high frequency preferred. Or for you, maybe, allowing yourself to watch a movie, high frequency, only after you complete a practice test, low frequency. You use a desired activity as a reward for doing a less desired one. Very practical.
Very practical indeed. I should try that. And finally, one more. Behavioral contrast. When did that occur? Sounds complex.
It's an interesting effect. Behavioral contrast happens when an individual has two different behaviors that have been equally reinforced, perhaps in different settings, and then suddenly the reinforcement for one of those behaviors stops entirely, extinction. What happens is the behavior that's no longer reinforced will decrease, as expected. But the other behavior, the one that's still being reinforced, will often temporarily increase above its original level. It's almost as if the organism compensates for the loss of reinforcement in one area by intensifying its effort in the area where reinforcement is still available.
Huh. Okay. And we also briefly touched on avoidance versus escape conditioning earlier when talking about negative reinforcement. Just to get these straight one last time. Avoidance conditioning sounds like stopping something before it even happens, like preventing a problem. And escape conditioning is about stopping something unpleasant after it's already started.
You've absolutely got it. Avoidance conditioning is performing a behavior to prevent an aversive event from happening at all, like paying your bills on time specifically to avoid getting hit with late fees. You act before the bad thing occurs. Escape conditioning, on the other hand, involves performing a behavior to stop an aversive event that has already begun, like hitting the snooze button to silence that incredibly annoying alarm that's already blaring. You're escaping something currently happening.
Perfect. That's a fantastic deep dive into operant conditioning. So many facets. Now, let's move to our third major theory, social learning theory. As our sources highlighted, this kind of arrived as a critique or maybe an evolution of classical and operant conditioning, suggesting they weren't the whole picture. What's its core idea?
Right. Social learning theory, strongly associated with Albert Bandura, proposes that much complex human learning occurs not just through direct classical pairings or direct operant consequences received by the learner, but primarily through observation and modeling. We learn a huge amount by watching others. Bandura argued that it's too simplistic, maybe even reductionist, to say we only learn based on our own past history of direct reinforcement. Instead, social learning theory puts a strong emphasis on cognition specifically, the cognitive anticipation of future reinforcement as a major motivator for our behavior. We think ahead, we anticipate that if we perform a certain behavior we saw someone else do, there will likely be a reward, and that anticipation drives us to act.
Okay, so it's bringing the thinking process, the cognition, back into learning in a big way. It's not just about what has happened to us directly, but what we expect to happen based on observing others. And this theory also introduces that concept of reciprocal determinism. What does that mean for how learning actually takes place? It sounds like a two-way street.
It is exactly a two-way or even three-way street. Reciprocal determinism explains that learning isn't just the environment acting on the person or the person acting on the environment. Instead, there's a dynamic, continuous, multidirectional interaction between the person, including their thoughts, beliefs, expectations, biology, their behavior, their actions, and the environment, the social and physical context, including reinforcers. It's a loop where each element influences and is influenced by the others, rather than just a simple one-way causal chain, much more complex and arguably realistic.
That makes a lot more sense for explaining complex human behavior. So if I'm learning by observing someone, according to Bandura, there are specific steps I need to go through for that observation to actually translate into learning and doing the behavior myself.
Absolutely. Bandura outlined 4 essential steps or processes required for observational learning to occur successfully. They have to happen in sequence. First, you need attention. You obviously must be paying attention to the model and the behavior they're performing. If you don't see it, you can't learn it. Second is retention. You have to be able to retain or remember what you observed. This involves mentally coding and storing the information, maybe as images or verbal descriptions. Third is production, or reproduction. You must have the physical and cognitive capability to actually reproduce the observed behavior yourself. You might retain how a gymnast does a flip, but lack the ability to produce it.
Okay, attention, retention, production. And the final one, which ties back to that cognitive anticipation piece, is motivation, right? There needs to be some reason, some anticipated reinforcement or incentive for you to actually perform the behavior you've learned through observation. And presumably that reinforcement also needs to actually occur, at least sometimes, to keep the cycle going. If you don't anticipate a reward, or if the reward never comes when you try it, you're probably less likely to perform that observed behavior again.
Precisely. Motivation is key. You might learn how to do something perfectly by watching, but if there's no incentive, no anticipated reward, or maybe even anticipated punishment, you might never actually perform the behavior. It really brings together the cognitive factors, attention, retention, anticipation, the behavioral factors, production, and the environmental factors, the model, the potential reinforcement. It's the full circle.
Yeah.
So there we have it. We've navigated three really powerful frameworks for understanding how we learn and behave. From the automatic, almost reflexive associations of classical conditioning to the deliberate actions shaped by their consequences in operant conditioning. And finally, the rich, cognitively driven observational learning proposed by social learning theory, allowing us to mimic, anticipate, and learn from the world around us.
What's truly fascinating here, and what I hope you take away, is how these concepts aren't just, academic theories locked away in textbooks. They are actively playing out in your life every single day, often completely without you even realizing it. The next time you find yourself avoiding a certain food because of a bad experience you had years ago, classical conditioning, or maybe find yourself procrastinating and only doing a task at the last minute right before a deadline, fixed interval schedule perhaps, or even just pick up a new skill or phrase simply by watching or listening to someone else, social learning. You're experiencing these powerful principles in action.
And this naturally leads to an important question, a challenge almost for you listening. Now that you're equipped with this deeper understanding of how learning works, how might you intentionally, consciously apply these principles, classical, operant, social, to maybe shape new positive behaviors in your own life? Or perhaps to overcome old, unhelpful habits? Or even to teach or guide others more effectively, whether it's your kids, your colleagues, or even yourself?
Lots to think about there. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of learning. Until next time, keep observing, keep learning, and definitely keep asking those fascinating questions about why we do what we do.